Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome in. Hi, folks. Welcome to class. Hello, Kiara. Natalia, hi. Hey, Joseph. How's it going? Celestine, hello, hello. Welcome in, folks. Got a nice little lesson today. My hope is to finish in the next 15, 20 minutes. Really and truly, we can get through this one pretty quickly. We'll spend some time talking about some of the ideas that Darwin discovered on his trip, the HMS Beagle that we saw yesterday. And then I can give you some time to ask all sorts of questions with regards to the assignment and give you some time to work on it. How long is the max and minimum our video is supposed to be? I would say the minimum should be like 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes for one question. The maximum should be anywhere from 6 to 7 minutes for one question. So overall, you're looking at a max total of like 15 to 16 minutes. I'm not putting a hard cap on it, really and truly, because I don't think that there should be a limit or a min or a max. If you can do it in 5 minutes, that's cool. If you can do it in 7 minutes, that's cool. If you do it in 2 minutes, that's cool. So I'm not really looking for a hard cap. Each question's different. You might have to take more time for some questions, and other questions you might be able to do in a minute or two. So I'm not really going to say a hard cap, yes or no, to any of them, as long as you meet the requirements and answer the question in a simplified form using all the things at your expense or at your dispense, then I will be fine with however long it is. The only thing I'll say is that please don't make a single question video like 10, 15 minutes. It shouldn't take you that long to describe some of the ideas and concepts. And if you are taking that long, chances are you're either repeating yourself or you're missing some stuff and you're just kind of rambling. I did 5 minutes. That's cool. Is it okay if I describe the Punnett square? As long as you didn't use terms that we were not allowed to use, then yes, that's perfectly fine. So welcome in, folks. My hope is that you all had a solid day of reading yesterday when you looked at 7.3 with regards to Charles Darwin and the HMS Beagle. Then you did 5 minutes for each question or 5 minutes in total. Yes, excellent question, Daniel. Or excellent question, Natalia, sorry, for Daniel. Five minutes for each of them. Yeah, that checks out. I would say that's kind of like the average I would expect. I use the Punnett square to explain my work. Is that fine? I didn't use any terms, though. I just called it a table. Yes, that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine, Kiara. Natalia, it doesn't have to be 10 minutes total, right? If one answer is 3 minutes and one answer is 4 minutes, that's fine too, right? Or if one answer is 6 minutes and one answer is 7 minutes, that's fine too. It's not that big of a deal. What if I did 2 minutes and 30 seconds? Is that fine for each question or total? If it's 2 minutes for each question, that's fine. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I would expect the average, like I said, one of my answers is 3 minutes and the next is like 2. That's okay too. Again, right? Like I'm not expecting people to go into extreme amounts of detail. And if you do, that's fine as well, right? I really just want to see how you explain things. Some people explain things a little bit more concise. Some people explain things a little bit more long-term. I'm fine with either way. I'm fine with either way. Really, the main thing for me was just to ensure that that you weren't going too long or too short. Like no one should be like 30 seconds, right? No one should be that short. If you did a little bit longer than that or a little bit shorter than that, that 3 or 4 minutes mark, that's fine. I'm allowed to talk about F1 gen and F2 gen. I would say call it something different because F1 and F2, that's like that's a term you learned in this class, right? So it may, okay, then that's fine. The first generation, that's fine. That's fine. As long as you're not using like shorthand term like F1, F2, et cetera, then that's fine. All right, let me take attendance real quick and then we will get started. It's 12:25, so Lisa's here, Anna's here, Arlena's here, Ashley's here. No, Ashley, yeah, Ashley's here. Catherine's here, Celestine is here. No, Christina, Daniel, Dominic, Emily, Hamid, Han, Haolin. No, Haolin. This lesson is interesting. I think I'll talk a little bit after once I finish taking attendance because I really like the gravitas, if you will, of this lesson. It, to me, speaks a great deal to the concepts that we will learn throughout this unit. And so I want to spend some extra time just kind of like framing the overall idea, because next lesson on Monday on the origin of species, the title of Darwin's book, again, right? Like we've been building up the last couple of days to kind of get to this point to speak of the theory of evolution. And so today we are going to look at evidence that Darwin gathered on the HMS Beagle throughout his trips throughout South America and Africa. And we're going to look at that evidence and kind of put it into perspective with regards to some of the ideas that we've learned from last lesson. And all of it will kind of come together nicely on Monday as we connect each of these pieces of evidence, theories, ideas that Darwin, that predicated or that were part of the predecessors that Darwin studied under and learned from. And we're going to tie it all together nicely on Monday to develop the theory of evolution. So my hope is that you read the readings yesterday with regards to Darwin and the HMS Beagle. So you should be able to look at these questions and answer them on your own based on what you read yesterday. So I won't go into that too much because it's more of the historical context of Darwin. And again, that was kind of, I gave you that responsibility yesterday to kind of read through it. So if you have read through it, excellent. You should have at least a very general idea of each of those questions. And if you didn't read through it, I would strongly encourage that you read 7.3 from yesterday's homework just to provide some historical context. But at the end of the day, it's not dire if you did not. It's okay, because we're going to look at two of those questions in a bit more detail as we move through this lesson, as well as, the other lessons throughout this unit. So let's get started and take a look at some of the observations that Darwin made on the coast of South America and in the Patagonia, as well as the Galapagos Islands, because as he sailed through the coast of South America, Darwin collected evidence and samples over the years that he was on this journey. And it's an exhaustive journey in terms of the amount of evidence that he collected. Exhaustive meaning like he was exceptionally thorough with his observations and what he saw, and he was uncanny in his ability to see things and patterns based those on some of the evidence that he not only had from prior people that were before him, like Lyell, Dubuffon, Cuvier, but he also made those connections to the evidence that he found in the Galapagos and in South America. So some of the important observations that we're going to focus on today are three main observations in the context of these general observations. And then you'll see in the next chart, we'll kind of connect it to some of the more specific observations he made on the Galapagos when taken into consideration with South America. So in the Patagonia, he made some observations with regards to the discovery that modern and extinct animals that are somewhat resembling each other seem to share the same habitat. So these habitats allow for specific traits to be flourishing. And the main reason is that, again, kind of looking back to that Dubuffon idea that the environment shapes the way species and organisms behave. This is another observation that Darwin made in the Patagonia along the coast of Ecuador in Chile. And he saw that these habitats kind of created animals that were either extinct or still around that had some type of similarities with them. So he's like, a lot of these birds and a lot of these land animals and a lot of these plants and a lot of these trees and all these things that he saw in this area, they kind of had similar properties based on the climate that they were in. And so this is one of the first times, again, if you read on the origin of species, this is one of the first time where Darwin saw what was like what we now kind of know as like a cactus. And he saw them widespread throughout areas that were dry. And again, Darwin came from England, and I don't know if anyone knows about the climate of England, but there are no deserts in England. It is quite rainy in jolly old England, and it is exactly as Maddie says, it's wet. There's a lot of rain, a lot of precipitation. There are no deserts. So he had never seen a cactus before. And in the Patagonia and especially in some parts of the Atacama Desert specifically, he saw many of these cacti that existed, and everyone knew about cacti, but it was the first time that he really thought about it in the context of, these cactus tend to be in areas where they're dry and desert-like, and trees and shrubs and bushes and grasses tend to be in areas where there is a lot more water. Cactuses. Yeah. So he was like, the habitat must have an impact, must have an impact. The idea that was next observed was that high in the Andes Mountains, so he sent expeditions into the Andes Mountains, hundreds of meters up, and he found fossils of aquatic organisms. We kind of alluded to that yesterday, that fossils kind of appeared in weird places, and that evidence was captured by Darwin. He saw that these aquatic fossils of fish and whales and crabs. The Patagonia is along the coast, the western coast of South America. So Chile, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, all of those countries along the west coast of South America is known as the Patagonia. So he found, yeah, no worries, Luca. No worries, Luca. So he found that these Andes Mountains, high up, hundreds of meters into the air, had aquatic organisms. And again, if you recall from Lyell's ideas about that slow changing Earth, you can kind of take into consideration that large scale changes to the planet have an impact on the organisms that exist. So if the Andes, for example, was once underwater, which it was. If you take geology and learn about the history of the planet, you'll see that the Andes Mountains and the west coast of Chile as a whole, it used to be a fault line that was well underneath the ocean. And so animals, organisms would die, they would be buried, they'd fossilize, and then a huge event, which I'll talk about later, that caused these Andes to kind of come up and carry with it all the fossils that was in the sediment and the shale. And again, it's hard to kind of imagine these ideas, but we must think in the context of millions upon hundreds of millions of years, because 500 million years is a long time for the planet to change. The last main observation that he made with regards to the Galapagos Island, which will be the focal point of our lesson today, was that he realized on this Galapagos Island that there was unique and unusual plant and animal life that was kind of similar, but not quite the same as the species that he found on the actual proper continent of South America. So he was starting to see these observations over the first decade of his journey and his evidence collection that maybe there was some type of impact that was changing the way that these organisms behave, changing the way that these organisms adapt to their environment, and overall what allowed for them to develop specific traits that we will see as we move through. Okay, any questions to the introductory ideas with regards to some of the things that Darwin discovered in his initial observations? Mm-hmm. All right, questions. No questions. Pretty straightforward so far. I see from the couple of check marks that people are giving me. Thank you so much once again. Appreciate that immediate feedback. It helps me a great deal when it comes to just a snapshot. You don't always have to type in the chat, yes, I'm good, or no, I have no idea what you're talking about. Having those check marks just to show up real quick allows for me to get a nice little quick snapshot about how everyone's feeling. So if you do have questions, my hope is that you'll type it in the chat, PM me, what have you. And otherwise, my hope is that the information is sitting with you okay. All right, let's move on and take a look at some of the ideas that Darwin started to develop as a result of these initial observations. So the concept of biogeography, which is the study of geographic distributions of organisms based on both living species and fossils. And this tries to answer the question, why do things live where they do? Why are they there? Why are they the way that they are? And does the thing or does the environment impact it as much as we might think it is? And Darwin was one of the earliest biogeographists that existed. Lyell, along with some others with regards to Dubuffon and Cuvier, were also some of the earlier adopters of the idea that this scientific study of biogeography, it really takes into consideration the organism as well as its environment, because Darwin discovered some incredible things in the Galapagos. Darwin discovered some incredible things in the Galapagos. He found, among many of his observations, he found specifically that the Galapagos Islands really showed a link between the habitat an organism lives in and the traits of that organism. The traits that help those organisms to survive show up far more often in very specific environments than the traits that don't really do anything or are detrimental to survival. And on Monday, when we look at the origin of species and the idea of the theory of evolution, we'll see how the evidence that Darwin collected really contributed to this idea that habitat shapes the way that the organism lives, and that we would expect traits that are beneficial to show up far more often in environments that allow for that trait to be successful. And then we will connect those ideas to why we see that in humans, because it does happen in humans as well. We are no different, really and truly, than other species that live on this planet, in the context of we are also shaped by our habitat, and we in turn shape it. So it's important to consider these ideas, I think. All right, let me just make sure I got everyone that showed up. Those of you who got here a little late, welcome. Hopefully you've been able to catch up with regards to the note. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer them. So some of the other concepts that I want to spend some time talking about with regards to the Galapagos is a couple of ideas with regards to the landmass itself. So let's take a look at the Galapagos. So if you've never seen where the Galapagos are, it's off the coast of Ecuador. The capital of Ecuador is Quito. The most important thing to consider here, and this is something that I really like to draw out to students' attentions, take a look at some of the shapes. Take a look at some of the shapes of the island and how you might be able to potentially jigsaw some of these pieces into the coast here. Because it's important to consider that the Galapagos Islands used to be connected, and this is, Darwin didn't know this at the time, but now we as geologists and biologists can see this. The coast of Ecuador looked very different. The Galapagos actually used to be a part of it, right? It used to be a part of it, yeah. Plate tectonics moved things and moved the continents and land masses over a long period of time. Yeah, as Maddie says, Pangaea, which, you know, if you look up Pangaea or you've studied it in geography in grade 9 or geography in grade 11, you'll see that Pangaea, which is the large landmass that was the Earth many millions of years ago, over those hundreds of millions of years, the landscape changes, and it's still changing to this day. 100 million years from now, the planet will look very different than it does now. So it's important to consider that the Galapagos Islands, a couple 100 million years, or well, I want to say 15 million years ago. I can never remember off the top of my head. I'm bad with dates. That's why I don't really like turning this into a history class. I'm not one to just be like, oh yes, in 13.7 years ago in the Cambrian period, the Galapagos. No, I'm not good with that. But I know at one point, the Galapagos Islands, in many ways, were connected to Ecuador. So that's why we start to see some of the species that exist on the Galapagos and Ecuador having some links. Now, with that being said, it gets confounded a little bit because there are some species that I'll talk about in a second, like birds or plants or insects, for example, that do make their way from Ecuador into the Galapagos. And I'll talk about that in just a second as we move on to the next page. But it's important to consider that it used to be, the Galapagos used to be in some ways connected to Ecuador. So keep that idea in mind as we move to the next section of this lesson, okay? Be mindful of that. Be mindful of that idea. And let's take a look at some of the observations and theories that Darwin came up with on his journeys and on his time, during his time, I should say, in the Galapagos. Because, you know, if again, I can't strongly recommend this enough to you. It's a challenging read, but if you are curious to pursue biology and specifically evolution and genetics any further, at some point in time, I would encourage you to skim through the theory of the origin of life. On the Origin of Life by Charles Darwin. It's a hard read, like I said, because of the old English language that he spoke and used in the 1800s and 1900s. But it's important to kind of get a little framework revolved around it. I've read it, I read it. I skimmed through it. I should say a better thing to say is I skimmed through it, and it really is truly amazing some of the ideas that he had. So, strong recommend. I agree. Old English books are very hard. I think there was a modern day one where someone like translated it from the older English that was spoken in the late 1800s to like a bit more modern language. But there's also audiobooks that kind of put it into context. And then there's like, if you take a genetics class or a biological evolution class in an evolutionary biology class in undergraduate, they'll also spend some time with it too. So anyways, let's get on to the next part where Darwin's observations and his theories on the remote islands kind of are starting to come into play here. Can it stop snowing? It was like whiteout conditions. I want to say like an hour ago or so in downtown Toronto. I usually can see quite far to the east, to the lake even, 30, 40, 50 kilometers. Well, no, that's not right. 20, 30 kilometers or so. And yeah, it was whiteout. I couldn't see maybe past 5 kilometers. It was crazy. It's my one brother's birthday today. For those of you that go to U of T, Scarborough specifically, in the next 2 years, you might have a professor by the name, similar last name as mine. And it's his birthday is today. And on his day of birth, 30 odd years ago, it snowed. So happy birthday to Mr. Ketasol too. Yeah. He'll correct you and say that's actually Dr. Ketasol, but I just give him a hard time about it. So my birthday's on the 30th. If it's still snowing, I'm gonna cry. You know what? I want to say I watched the Jays playoff game in early May once, I want to say. Is that right? No, maybe it was just a Jays game. No, that was in October. Never mind. I'm confounding information. Doesn't get it. Yeah. All right. So let's take a look at Darwin's observations from the Galapagos, because he made 4 crucial observations just in the Galapagos alone. The first is that many species of plants, birds, insects, and sometimes reptiles existed on the island. And he developed a hypothesis around this idea. And he said, yeah, some of these animals are able to get to the island from the mainland. Plants, their seeds can float in water or their pollen can float in the air. Birds can obviously fly the 100 kilometers. That is the distance from the Galapagos to the mainland. Same thing with insects. And some reptiles that exist on the island are able to get there as well. Depending on the type of reptile, they can make their way through the ocean. However, there were no native amphibians on the island. Remember, amphibians are different than reptiles. There were no native amphibians on the island and very, very few land mammals. And the main reason he had an hypothesis about this was that they were unable to get there from the continent. So they could not swim. Amphibians cannot really survive in salt water. And land mammals, like you're not going to see a cow jump into the ocean on the coast of Ecuador and just kind of like paddle the 100 kilometers to land. That's not really a thing, right? It's not really a thing. You don't see possums just doing that. Minecraft says otherwise. Yes, Minecraft says so yes, I would say let's try our best to not base our understanding of biological evolution on Minecraft. It's a good educational game and it's interesting for building, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say let's try our best not to base those fundamental ideas on that. Prince George's mansion in Minecraft. Oh dear. Oh, Prince Gongs? Who's Darwin's Gong? I don't think I know that. That's neat though. Cool. Yeah, Minecraft's cool. I remember playing it when it first came out, and it's like truly imagination run wild. Like whatever you can think of to build, it's something else. It's one of the coolest things. I can't stress enough how neat it is. Anyways. So another main observation that Darwin made is that he saw that there were still many unique species found nowhere else on Earth on the Galapagos. So he would think to himself, well, these species are kind of similar to what we see, but they're so unbelievably unique. Why would this happen? Well, because the original population began to change based on that new habitat. Recall, the Galapagos split apart from Ecuador over 100 million years ago. And as a result of that change, as it moved further and further, animals that were already there or animals that got there and spent time there became more and more isolated from the rest of the coast of Ecuador. And that really changed the way that their environment behaved, because instead of being able to go back and forth or spending more time closer onto the coast, they are now on an island. And an island has very different climate, precipitation, etc., compared to the coast. So as a result of that, the population of animals and organisms began to change as well. So these unique species closely resembled species on the nearest mainland continent, i.e. Ecuador's coast. And that's because the original population likely came from the nearby continent in some way, whether they migrated over there and stayed, whether they were there at the start when the tectonic shift 100 million years ago moved the island far from the coast, or it made their way by other means. The original population likely came from the nearby continent. And these hypotheses proved to be true on other remote islands like Hawaii as well, because those islands used to be part of several different pieces of land that was part of like the coast of Southeast Asia, the Polynesian islands. All of those used to be chunks of a piece of a mainland that used to be, we'll say that it fit into parts of India, parts of China, parts of South Korea, parts of that coast along Southeast Asia. As they broke off from each other due to tectonic shifting hundreds of millions of years ago, we see the same theories hold water and hold true when you think of these concepts here. So Darwin saw these ideas, and they in fact are very similar to what we see in other islands. So the overall idea here being that these pieces of evidence that he collected kind of rang true and consistent no matter which island system or which island continent combination we looked at. So it's important and interesting to consider, because now we're seeing a theory that not only makes sense in the Galapagos, but it branches out to other places, and it actually makes sense for those places as well. And as we talked about it earlier in this unit, you need to have that reproducibility. It has to be consistent in many different ways in order for it to kind of be taken as a theory. So it's interesting to consider. So that's the first part of this lesson that I wanted to spend some time talking about. Those ideas we'll visit again as we move through this lesson. There's one other part, and I want to spend some time talking about this part here with you because it kind of connects to those ideas, because Darwin also made several different observations about species that we see in general today, not just the ones that are on the Galapagos or that were on the coast of Ecuador, but in other species as well. And this is thanks to some of the work of Cuvier, who looked at those organisms and species that kind of had similar things going on with them. All right. Before I move on to those aspects, though, are there any questions about those observations that Darwin made? Or is everyone okay with those concepts? Or does anyone have any thoughts about those concepts? A couple of check marks showing me that you're in the green. So that means you're okay, I hope. All right. I'll give everyone another minute or two to think about it, and then we'll take a look at some of the ideas that kind of connect to Cuvier as well as Darwin's observations en masse, so to speak. So. All right, no questions, it seems. So let's move on and talk a little bit about how some of these observations connect to some of the ideas that were already kind of discussed by some of Darwin's colleagues previously. And Darwin started to collect evidence for some of these things. So one idea I want to spend some time talking about with you is homologous features and development patterns. Again, when we think of our Latin prefixes, homo meaning the same, logos meaning of structure. So homologous features are physical structures that are the same, but have different modern day functions. So I use the example of human, cat, whale, bat. All mammals all have the same bones and bone structure in their arms, same number of bones, radius, ulna, humerus, metacarpals, phalanges, same number of bones in all four of those species, but each of those species uses their limb differently. Hands in humans, we obviously have the fine motor to type, write, play instruments, make art, etc. Cats have the exact same number of bones in their limbs, except cats' arms and their forelegs and their hind legs, they have a really strong shock absorption ability. So the bones have shifted and the muscles and ligaments and everything have evolved over time to be really good at absorbing shock. Whales, again, similar mammals, bone structure is the exact same number of bones, same layout. However, they use their fins to swim and to navigate the ocean. And lastly, one more, the bat, same number of bones, same structural layout. However, bats can fly. So again, homologous features show that the idea of bone structures can allow for different function, but same structure. That's why my cat jumps so hard. We call her Kathunk. That's a good name for a cat. That's a good name for a cat. Alrighty, so another idea that will be discussed later on, not so much in this lesson, is embryology. The early stages of embryos for a lot of mammals are the exact same. So embryos from 0 to 12 weeks for 99% of mammals look the exact same. We'll come back to this later next week as we look at some of the evidence for evolution as a connection to that idea with regards to embryos. And ultimately, we will connect it to some of the general theories that we've looked at today. And then lastly, the ideas here that we kind of discuss, as I alluded to earlier, we will suggest and support a shared common ancestry. If you recall from Unit 1, in the phylogenetic trees that we looked at, we saw a lot of aspects of shared ancestry. And now we can start to use this idea and this evidence that, several of these scientists and philosophers discovered. We can start to connect it with our understandings of phylogenetic trees. So just like with homologous features and development patterns, we can also have what's called analogous features. And these are interesting because these analogous features, analogous, ana meaning of different, logos meaning of structure, means that they can have similar functions but very different structures. Insects, birds, bats, all three of them are able to fly. But their wing structure for insects is very different from birds, which are very different from bats. And this suggests that all three of these traits, the ability to fly, evolved separately to adapt to environments that were very similar, but not quite the same. And so while they don't quite share a recent common ancestor, they are still able to evolve the ability to fly as a result of those environmental pressures. Again, we will talk about all those different things, but we'll get there. Alrighty, and then the last concept I want to spend some time talking about with you all today, before I leave you go for the day, is the idea of vestigial features. We kind of talked about vestigial features yesterday. We spent some general time talking about them in the context of humans, but we see here again, Darwin found evidence for vestigial features of modern species that have traits that are no longer functional or useful, but used to be useful in an ancestor. And again, further supports the evidence and ideas of evolution. So again, in common ancestry, these may have served a purpose. So again, when you look at pigs, horses, and dogs, all with a somewhat similar and recent common ancestry, the structures may have served a useful purpose. But as the environment shaped and branched those species off, they became useless for some. The horse is the best example. They have the exact same bone structure. It's like an exterior digit as dogs and pigs and other hooved animals and cloven pod animals. And as a result of selective pressures, the horse's bones that are similar to pigs and dogs moved up and became, for all intents and purposes, useless. That reminds me. Yes, Daniel, what does it remind you of? Is there like a vein that like looped under something through its extremely? Yeah, we'll talk about that. That's next Monday. We'll talk about giraffes. Wisdom teeth are vestigial. Appendixes vestigial. The pinky toe is kind of vestigial some ways. So if they figured out what the appendix was useful for, even in the first century, is just appendicitis. Yeah. Multiple organs. You can survive with one kidney and one lung, technically. Yeah, I'll talk about what the appendix used to be for in a bit, or well, next week, Maddie. I'll talk about that. But it did help in digestion, or it's postulated that it helped in digestion. Yeah, we'll get there. Don't worry. We got plenty of time. We're barely a week into this unit. We got plenty of time to learn all sorts of new stuff. But it was postulated that it helped with digestion. Like it released a chemical that helped with vegetable digestion, because early on, early humans or even predecessor humans were much more vegetarian than we are now. When are you going to tell us the next SWAT story after this unit? Imagine if aliens with one eye would think about animals with two eyes. Well, we'll talk about xenobiology a little bit later on, Daniel. That's something I'm quite fascinated in. I will mention it at the end of this unit a little bit, not much, just because it's not so much a science as it is so much a hypothesis, but we will spend some time talking about why specific traits come up and why it's important. Why are there so many biologies? Because you got to specialize. You got to specialize. Many different biologies are different. Is there a course on xenobiology? Yeah, 4th year or 3rd year university, depending on your biology science program, they will have xenobiology. Oh, yeah. Ketone cell biology. Yes, that is the general biology. I teach gen bio, so yeah, we'll call that ketone cell biology. What would they teach? Well, it's mainly theory, but it just talks about what allows for organisms to survive in space to a certain extent. And also, more importantly, it postulates ideas about which traits would be consistent based on gravity, based on light, based on traits of other environments that exist on hypothetical planets. I learned that today that I hate thermochemistry. That's interesting. Ducks need gravity to swallow. There's no space, yeah, thus no space for ducks. Exactly. But on a planet that has gravity, you could see ducks. Yeah, it's really neat, Daniel. Look into it. There are courses online and books you can read about xenobiology, so it's pretty neat. So yeah, I was going to say at 105, but yes, the lesson is done. There's no more that I have to say on this lesson. If you want to hang around and ask questions or talk xenobiology, I'm more than happy to answer any and all questions. If you want to ask questions about the assignment, you can. If you want to leave the Zoom and work on your assignment outside of it for the next 40 minutes, I encourage you to do so, because I want to make sure you have enough time today and tomorrow to work on that assignment and get it done and dusted for midnight tomorrow. So if you would like to leave the Zoom chat, I will see you all later. I'll still be kicking around here for the next 35 minutes to answer questions. Otherwise, have a great day, folks. We'll see you tomorrow, okay? All right, folks. See you later. Bye, everyone. Bye. For the assignment. Yes, you do have to send a video for the assignment. Yep. Including you, yes. Yep. Yep, you should definitely be in there. All right, see you later, Han. You're welcome.